Can I kick off with the budget? Because, I mean, Rachel Reeves was tearing the budget apart yesterday afternoon in the Commons. What is wrong with what the government has done from your perspective?
Well, we really needed to realise the promise and potential of our country. We've had 13 years of really low growth, but unfortunately, what we saw in the budget is growth being downgraded and really continuation of the Conservatives' approach of managed decline. Well, that isn't Labour's approach. We're far more ambitious for our country. That's why we've said we'd have the mission of our country having the highest economic growth in all of the G7. And that's why we set out plans to get us there. We didn't get those plans, unfortunately, from the Conservative Chancellor. We got sticking plasters, we got more short-term measures. We didn't get that plan to really boost growth into the medium and long term and improve people's living standards. And of course, what we did get was an enormous £1 billion bung, effectively, to the very best of people in our country with those pensions changes, not a targeted change like was needed, but a huge giveaway. So the wrong priorities coming from the Conservatives on the budget.
I think many people would be very surprised by your reaction there to the budget, because there was a huge announcement on childcare, a huge giveaway to caregivers, to parents, mainly women. And as the Shadow Secretary of State for Women and Equalities, I thought you would be very supportive of the plan for any child over the age of 9 months, 30 hours of free childcare. I mean, that's a huge expansion of the welfare state, isn't it? Surely that's something that you support.
Well, I've repeatedly called on government to be focusing on childcare. It's good they finally started to talk about it. But when we have the kind of reform of childcare that we need to see, it's got to be well thought through, and it needs to make that difference to parents that you just mentioned as being so important. When Labour set out plans for childcare, we said exactly how we would pay for them. We made sure that the workforce would be there. So for that first step towards reform that we announced, breakfast clubs, we said exactly how we were going to deliver it. And we made sure that it would be making a big difference to parents quickly. I'm afraid when we compare that with the Conservatives' approach here, it's completely different, because we've already, just a couple of days after the Conservatives' announcement, got loads of enormous questions coming from parents, coming from those who run nurseries and other provision. They're saying, well, actually, how can we deliver this? In fact, some are saying it could even result in a reduction of provision, because you won't have the cross-subsidy from 1- and 2-year-old paid provision into the 3- and 4-year-old paid for hours by the government. So they're saying it could actually result in that reduction in supply. If you look at what the government said around so-called wraparound care, again, unlike Labour, they've not set out exactly how this is going to be paid for into the future. It seems to be effectively a kind of pilot programme, a pathfinder programme for a couple of years. Well, how will that be sustained? So I know I'm getting into the details around this, but they are important, because we've seen so many nurseries closing, so much provision being scaled back. It's been mums and dads who felt the impact of that, and their kids. So when government announces change, they need to show that it's well thought through, and it just doesn't look like that's happened.
Well, talk about being well thought through. I mean, clearly one thing which you seem passionate about is the opportunity to get more people back into work. The pension scheme was about getting more people back into work. I mean, I know there's been focus on consultants and things, but, the idea is it encourages more people over 50 to keep working and be able to keep saving in their pension. Keir Starmer turned around pretty instantly, didn't he, and said, when we get into power, we're going to abolish all of this. We're just going to get rid of it altogether. You're being accused, there's a story on the front of the Times this morning covering this, but basically saying, if you're going to cause a bit of a gold rush on pensions, if you like. People are going to start putting money in, and if you get into power in the next 18 months, well, people are going to start walking away from their jobs in droves.
Well, no, I don't think that's right. And actually, not just Labour, but all of those in the health service who were calling for this change said it needed to be targeted. It needed to be targeted on those consultants, on those individuals in the health service where there was a specific problem for them. You know, the BMA, for example, so that effectively the trade union for doctors, they called for a very targeted scheme to relieve that pressure on the NHS. And of course, we've got 7 million people now waiting on waiting lists under the Conservatives. So action did need to be taken. But what we got instead of that targeted measure was a huge, enormous giveaway, £1 billion. Now, at a time when so many people are struggling with the cost of living, to be handing over £1 billion, so not just for doctors where there's that specific issue, but for other people who are incredibly wealthy, you know, stockbrokers, property developers, anyone who falls into that top 1% getting that benefit. That's not sensible. It's not sensible for our public finances, and it's very unfair on everybody else who's struggling so much at the moment with the cost of living.
So you don't mind rich consultants getting a benefit, but just not other people. But I mean, and let's be clear, it's not a handover of money, is it? It's terms of lost revenue rather than actually handing money out of the exchequer. But you said about the government's plans not being well thought through. Don't you think, in some respects, you would have been better off, even if you came to the same conclusion, better off thinking through your response rather than just saying, do you know what, we're going to scrap it, we're just going to reverse it?
Well, we have thought through our response because we've been listening to what those in the NHS said that they needed, and we've always been focusing on these issues with our determination to make sure that there's value for money for the taxpayer, that always we will be protecting the money in people's pockets. Now, the government had choices at the time of this budget. They could have had that targeted approach to support our NHS. Instead, they had that huge £1 billion giveaway. Again, they could have plugged the loopholes in the windfall tax. They chose not to, and to leave money from oil and gas companies on the table. And yet again, they also could have got rid of that non-dom tax exemption. They chose not to, and they left money on the table. You know, that is the difference between Labour's approach and the Conservatives' approach. We want to protect the money in people's pockets. We want to make sure that the majority of people in our country benefit. Instead, we see an approach from the Conservatives based on the very, very wealthiest. That is not the way that our country should be governed.
I wanted to ask you about the story that is dominating the front pages this morning. That is the breakthrough on NHS pay in terms of the nurses' dispute, 5% this year, the equivalent of 6% last year in terms of that one-off payment. It seems, we hope, once it's put to the members, to have met a resolution, hopefully come to an end. What do you make of this breakthrough?
Well, we really do hope that we may see an end now to that industrial action. It has been incredibly damaging, but, you know, that damage was avoidable. I'm sure that viewers will remember before Christmas, the nurses and the paramedics saying at that stage that they would call off industrial action if Conservative ministers actually sat down with them and had that negotiation. Of course, Rishi Sunak and his ministers did not sit down and have that proper negotiation on pay for a very, very long time. And it's been estimated that about 140,000 operations and appointments were cancelled because of the impact of that industrial action. And that's even before you take the junior doctors' strike into account that's just started. So, you know, the Conservatives have got to learn from this. They can't make the same mistakes when it comes to the junior doctors' strike. They really need to sit down and get a resolution to this, because otherwise we will see that impact ultimately on our patients and indeed on NHS staff as well.